Fox. And again, we continue to follow breaking news in our Trump verdict watch as the jury has sent its very first note to the judge with 4 different requests. I do want to bring in Neama Rahmani, who is a former federal prosecutor, attorney, and president of West Coast Trial Lawyers, to talk more about this breaking news. Neama, thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox.
Thanks for having me, Stephanie. Big news with this first jury note.
Yes, and I wanted to talk to you about the 4 requests that the jury has made, including David Pecker's testimony, a phone call, as well as Michael Cohen's testimony about that same Trump Tower meeting. With these 4 requests, can you share with us, what is so significant about this particular testimony?
Well, it is significant, and we know it's significant because this was the prosecution's first witness. So when you're the state, you want to start strong and you want to end strong. So prosecutors believe that Pecker was at least one of their best witnesses. So the fact that jurors are asking for a readback of his testimony is telling. That leads me to believe, and it's just speculation reading the tea leaves, that at least some of the jurors are ready to convict now, and they're using that readback to convince one or more holdout jurors or jurors that are on the fence.
So for folks who may not be so familiar with David Pecker's testimony, as you said, he's the very first witness. Prosecutors wanted to start strong and end strong, of course, with Michael Cohen. But David Pecker's testimony, particularly with this phone call, what is so significant about that snippet of testimony that jurors want to hear back?
Well, the defense argued that Cohen was acting alone and Trump had nothing to do with this alleged hush money scheme and the reimbursement. But David Pecker was a co-conspirator. He directly tied Trump to both the Karen McDougal story originally, and then, of course, the subsequent very similar catch and kill related to the Stormy Daniels story. So a very important witness, again, that really ties Trump to this whole conspiracy, this scheme to kill really 3 stories. The first related to the doorman at his building and the alleged illegitimate child. The second being the Karen McDougal former Playmate affair. And the third, of course, the most infamous Stormy Daniels, the adult film actress. So the fact that we're hearing and the jurors are going to rehear David Pecker's testimony, that's strong evidence for the prosecution. So that readback is a good sign for the state.
Let's talk about the timing of this first note. This comes about 3.5 hours or so into jury deliberations. Is there anything to glean from the timeline of that this is the very first note coming around 3.5 hours after they first started deliberating?
It is. So the fact that we're already getting a readback leads me to believe that the jurors have made significant progress. Oftentimes, and each jury will handle things differently, but they may go back into that deliberation room and do an initial poll. Obviously, if they're unanimous as to some or all counts, they'll move forward. But oftentimes they're not. And that's when those discussions begin. There will be a core group that will try to convince any undecided or holdout jurors. That's what I believe is happening here because, of course, the jury verdict has to be unanimous in a criminal case. 12 out of 12. Can't even have one person that's undecided or on the fence. So the fact that we're 3 hours in and we're getting some pretty favorable testimony from the prosecution's case in chief leads me to believe that this is a good sign for the prosecution. Now, there was a 4th question, a 4th readback related to Michael Cohen. We know that he's not the best witness. He was impeached. His credibility was attacked. He is an admitted liar, a convicted felon. So I wouldn't read a whole lot into Cohen's testimony. I think the strength of the state's case is all the additional evidence that really has nothing to do with Michael Cohen. I think if the jury is going to convict, it's going to convict in this case in spite of Michael Cohen, not because of him.
And let's talk about the potential options for the jury. As you mentioned, it needs to be unanimous. So what are the different options? One of them, of course, being a mistrial. So what could those possible outcomes be?
That's a great question, Stephanie. And one of those questions was answered this morning. I mean, sometimes people sleep on jury instructions and they think that they're boring and they tune away. But Judge Juan Merchan made three very important rulings this morning with respect to the law. One of those being there was no instruction on a lesser included. There was no option today for the jurors to return a verdict on misdemeanor counts. So let's talk about that. We know that under New York law, false business records are just a misdemeanor unless they're in furtherance of or to cover up another crime, in which case they become felonies. The judge didn't give the jurors any option this morning to return a verdict that the business records were false, but they weren't furthering or covering up another crime. So that leads me to believe that the options in this case are guilty as to felony counts, not guilty, or a hung jury. A hung jury happens when one or more jurors are unable to agree with the remaining jurors. So it could be 11-1, it could be 10-2, it could be 6-6, it could be anything in between. In which case, the judge will declare a mistrial and we'll have to start this whole thing all over.
Yeah, so how common is a hung jury? Because I would imagine that the judge does not want that to happen. You know, how common is that? And would a judge then just ask the jury, continue to deliberate and see if you can come to a unanimous decision?
It's not uncommon, and it's certainly very possible in this case because we're dealing with three issues that we don't typically see. First of all, we're dealing with a political trial. And even though the case needs to be decided solely based on the law and the facts and the evidence in this case, we would be lying to the American people if I wasn't saying that this is the most politicized trial in American history, period. Second, we have some convoluted legal arguments. And, really it's that in furtherance of or to cover up another crime part. We're talking about election fraud. We're talking about campaign finance violation. Also importantly, Judge Juan Merchan said tax crimes, that's a potential other crime. So we're dealing with not only false business records, were they actually legal expenses, were they reimbursement for hush money payments, but you have to really address another crime. And those crimes really aren't that simple, the tax, campaign finance, and election-related crimes. The third, of course, being the cast of characters that testified in this case. We have a former adult film star. We have Trump's former lawyer, a convicted felon. We have, frankly, lawyers that really weren't professional and didn't come across as that credible, that being Keith Davidson and Bob Costello. And of course, you have the head of the National Enquirer. So these aren't your typical witnesses in these cases. Some of them have admittedly participated in crimes and have been convicted. Others admitted and weren't charged. So I think there's a lot of different moving pieces, which leads me to believe that a hung jury is still a very real possibility in this case.
So let's talk about the timeline. Again, there are 34 counts that the jury has to consider right now. Does the length of deliberations signify anything? Again, we're about 4 hours into jury deliberations. So the longer the jury deliberates, does that signify anything in favor for the defense or the prosecution, or does that have no bearing on the possible outcome?
The length of deliberations absolutely does matter. The longer the jury deliberates, the more likely it is that we're going to get a hung jury. I think the possibility of an outright acquittal is low, given this very favorable venue in New York for the prosecution, given the makeup of these jurors, given the fact that we have two lawyers on the panel. I think Trump's best bet is going to be a hung jury in this case, given the different possibilities. So the longer the jury deliberates, the more likely it is it's going to hang. Now, there's no hard and fast rules, but a rule of thumb trial lawyers like myself use is jurors tend to deliberate on average about 1 hour for each day of witness testimony. This was a 20-day trial. And we also know that there's a lot of pressure on jurors to return a verdict before a weekend. So I wouldn't be surprised if we get a verdict tomorrow or Friday. If this continues into June and next week, I believe the chance of a hung jury increases significantly.
So when it comes to hung jury, is there a hard and fast rule in terms of how many days a jury has to deliberate and the judge says, go back to that room, see if you can figure out a unanimous decision? Or is it really when the jury says we've tried every option and we're getting nowhere? How how does the judge decide whether to accept that or not?
It's really up to the judge. And what will happen is this: if the jurors return a note saying we're unable to render a verdict or reach a unanimous decision, the judge will read them a special jury instruction. It's usually called an Allen charge, and he will instruct the jurors to go back into that jury deliberation room with an open mind to listen to their fellow jurors and to try to reach a unanimous verdict without compromising any of their beliefs or convictions. If they come back again and they say, Your Honor, we are hopelessly deadlocked, those are the magic words. If they say that to the judge, then the judge will have no choice but to declare a mistrial, discharge the jury, and we'll have to start this whole process all over again.
And again, you mentioned something, but I just wanted to reiterate it for our viewers here, is there was a question that I was going to ask. You answered it. Could a jury find Trump guilty of a lesser crime? And what you were sharing, if I'm understanding correctly, is no, in that a judge did not say that they could find Trump guilty of a misdemeanor. All of these 34 charges are felonies. So is this an all or nothing? Is it he's guilty of all 34 charges and they're all felonies, or that he's innocent of all of these charges?
I believe so. My three takeaways from jury instructions this morning were the following. I did not see an instruction on a lesser included where the jurors could find that the business records were false, but they weren't in furtherance of or to cover up another crime. That would just be a misdemeanor. Now, maybe neither party asked for a lesser included, or maybe the statute of limitations has run in New York on any potential misdemeanor violation. So it's an all or nothing situation, either felonies or an acquittal and not guilty. The other two takeaways were that Judge Juan Merchan said, even though the verdict has to be unanimous, the jurors do not have to be unanimous on what other crime was covered up or furthered as a result of the business records. And a key takeaway from the jury instructions today was that Judge Juan Merchan said the other crime could be election fraud, which was discussed at length. It could be a campaign finance violation, which was also discussed. But what really wasn't addressed during the trial is a third potential crime, and that is a tax crime. I think this was a big win for the prosecution because the legal argument in favor of a tax crime is much more straightforward. Trump and his organization allegedly wrote off $430,000 in legal expenses that wasn't a proper write-off because it was a reimbursement. I think that's something that is easier for the jurors to understand and accept in a legal write-off as opposed to an in-kind contribution to the 2016 Trump presidential campaign or the scheme to deceive the electorate. So I think that was also a win for the prosecution this morning.
Neama, before we let you go, and again, there's it just ever evolving, especially as we are on verdict watch right now. Anything else that you would really want to share or that has stood out to you or that you are anticipating as we await a verdict?
I think that this is a good sign. We need to be tracking these jury questions, the fact that they're asking for readback and testimony so early in the deliberations leads me to believe that at least some of their jurors have made their decision. The question is, can they convince those ones that are on the fence in the coming hours or days? And if so, hopefully we can get a verdict so none of us have to relive this trial again.
All right, Neama, thank you so much, as always, for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Stephanie.